Connie is entering. Okay, good. So hello everybody. Good morning in Brazil. Good afternoon in Europe and Africa, and good evening in Asia, and good night also I think in India and Indonesia. So we have planned, I propose that our conversation lasts during 2 hours, but in case the debate is heated and everybody agrees, we can extend, of course, the conversation. There is no problem for me as far as you are available, and I don't have any limit for the Zoom account, so there is no problem. Now, so it is supposed to be 2 hours, and we will have 9 speakers. 9 speakers. And I propose that we divide it into several rounds. And the first round, it will take 1 hour, more or less, for 9 speakers. So I will mention here Gracjan, the approach I proposed, since I do not know the content of every speech, so that I propose that the order of speakers is based on the geographical proximity with Ukraine. So looking at the map, world map, I put this order. First, Poland, represented by Gracjan Cimek. He is professor, doctor of of political science at Naval Academy of Gdynia. Do I pronounce correctly?
Correctly.
Okay, and then followed by Dragana Mitrovic from Serbia, professor, doctor, political economy and Chinese study at the University of Belgrade. Okay, and then Professor Hans Köchler, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy, University of Innsbruck in Austria, and now President of International Progress Organization based in Vienna. And then Dimitris Konstantakopoulos from Greece. He is journalist, former correspondent in Moscow, former advisor of Prime Minister Papandreou on East-West relation and arms control, and now editor of Defend Democracy Press based in Athens. And then Bruno Drosky, professor, doctor, political sciences and history, National Institute of Languages and Civilization, Paris. And Yin Chiguang, professor, doctor, political science, international relation from the University of Fudan in Shanghai. And then Professor Manoranjan Mohanty, Emeritus Professor of New Delhi of Political Sciences and Chinese Studies, and now also active at Council for Social Development based in New Delhi. And then Connie Rahakundini Bakri from Indonesia, doctor in Defense and Security Studies and senior defense and military analyst based in Jakarta or Bandung. I don't know, Bu Connie, you are in Bandung or in Jakarta?
Jakarta, Pak Darwis.
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
in Jakarta.
Bu Connie is based in Jakarta. And then Devon Dublin from Guyana. He is a doctor, medical doctor for animals, veterinary doctor and zoo technician, and also PhD and environmental management in Japan. But now he came back in his country in Guyana, and he is in World WWF Guyana. So we have 9 speakers. If everybody, so 1 hour, 60 minutes divided into 9, it means everybody more or less 6 minutes. Okay, at the first round, I mean, if we follow the tradition of Agora, well, Dimitris will correct me if I am wrong. That according to tradition in Agora, all the orators speak maximum 6 minutes at the first round. But we can, of course, tolerate if you go beyond 6 minutes. It's fine. So it is not supposed, you are not supposed to speak exhaustively all your views, but let's say a glimpse of your view. Okay. And then after that, at the second round, you can complete your view if necessary, and then we can open the question and answer. It is okay for you? I hope, at least. I hope that Dimitris does not protest. Okay, and then the co-chair, I am happy. I will go hand in hand with Beatrice Bisio, Professor, Dr. Political Sciences, and former journalist covering Middle East, and also historian, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, as co-host and co-chair with me, so that she will correct me if I am go wrong or I go too far, etc., etc. Okay, or I take more time. Now, why? So, since our conversation is Bandung Spirit Online Conversation Series, it is a part of the preparation for our commemorative conference of Bandung-Belgrade-Havana, which will take place in Indonesia at the end of October in conjunction with the G20 summit. So we are organizing a touring conference from Jakarta to Bandung to Surabaya, the summit in Bali, in the proximity of time and space with the G20. This is the event, our event. And Bandung Spirit, we call Bandung Spirit. What is the specificity? Because we are attached to Bandung Spirit. I mean, we are conference-based, community-based conference, or conversation-based conference. So everybody of these speakers are a part of our Bandung Spirit community. So I will just introduce a very short the principle, the 10 principle coexistence of the Bandung conference. So I will open the second. Do you see the second slides?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So that's why we call it peaceful coexistence, because it is very principle in Bandung conference. So you see here 10 principles, but I will just read some that I put in yellow because it is essential for our conversation. Respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations. Abstention from intervention or interference in the internal affairs of another country. Respect for the rights of each nation to defend itself singly or collectively in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations. Abstention from the use of arrangement of collective defense to serve any particular interest of the big powers. Abstention by any country from exerting pressures on other countries. Refraining from acts or threats of aggression or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any country. Settlement of all international disputes by peaceful means such as negotiation, conciliation, arbitration, or judicial settlements, as well as other peaceful means of the parties' own choice in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations. So this is the 10 principle of coexistence which is our reference as a Bandung community. Now, before start, I would like to go back a little bit to the history. Wars, there are some similarities with what happened now in Ukraine. So I will look now. I will bring you to Bandung. Do you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah, from 1945 to 1949, Indonesia was occupied by Anglo-Dutch army, okay? And on March 23rd, 1946, there is an event famously called Bandung Sea of Fire. Bandung was burned deliberately by Indonesian combatants against the Anglo-Dutch ultimatum to surrender. And from this event, so Bandung became the Sea of Fire. It is in March. Now we are in March also. It is in March 1946. So the song said like this. I translate it into English. Hello, hello Bandung, capital of Periangan. Periangan means West Java, but traditionally Periangan means abode of gods, or abode of divinities. So Bandung is the capital of abode of divinities because it's on the mountain. Bandung is on the mountain. Hello, hello Bandung, city of memories. It is long time I did not see you. Now you have become a sea of fire. Let us take it back. Let us take it back. This is the end of the song. And what happened? 1950 to 1953, it was Korean War. And on March 28, 2002, Megawati Soekarno-Putri, the president of Indonesia, visiting North Korea. And you know what? That the government of Korea gave an honor to Megawati by a song of Bandung sung by the choir of North Korean army. So I will put the song for 2 minutes. It's okay? The song by the North Korean army. So I will share now the song.
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
That was
So-
wonderful.
Did you hear the music?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Now, the last word of the music is, let us take it back. Let us take it back. And you imagine Ukraine become a sea of fire. Ukraine become a sea of fire. Who is supposed to take it back? Let us take it back. Who is supposed to take it back? Now, Gracjan, your turn. 6 minutes, please. Agora, please. Thank you.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm pleased to be able to participate in this important seminar at what it seems to be a crucial turning point in the evolution of the international order. Let's go to the core of the issue. Poland has been involved in the Russian-Ukraine conflict for years. Due to limited time, I want to divide my speech into two parts. The first about Polish geopolitical code since 1989 and the end of the Cold War. And second, for a description of the dynamics of involvement in recent days. Yes, in recent days. So, when it comes to the first aspect, Poland was the first country to recognize Ukrainian independence after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Polish geopolitical code referred to the geopolitical thought of Jerzy Giedroyć, who lived in exile in Paris, where he published the influential magazine Kultura. The essence of his thought was that Poland should form an alliance with Ukraine and Belarus as an independent states to counter the threat of Russian expansionism. Admittedly, he also wrote that if Ukrainian nationalists were to be strengthened, an agreement with Russia should be sought, but this threat is avoided. Why? Of course, it is connected with the Polish geopolitical situation in unilateral world order. According to the doctrine of Zbigniew Brzezinski, well-known advisor of Jimmy Carter and geopolitics from United States, the US assigned Poland the task of drawing Ukraine away from Russia as a condition for hindering the revival of the Russian Empire in any form. That is why Poland was involved in the so-called Orange Revolution in 2004 and in Euromaidan in 10 years later in 2014, where the Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski, together with the German and French foreign ministers, guaranteed President Yanukovych, former president of Ukraine, that he would remain in power and hold legal elections. As we know, this did not happen. The effect was the coup d'etat. And now for the second part, I argue that there are two blocks today, antagonistic blocks. The first one is the Anglo-Saxon maritime powers concentrated in AUKUS and against them continental Sino-Russian bloc. AUKUS, of course, is created as a form of alliance between Australia, United Kingdom, and United States. But I think that is a core alliance which is aimed to defend the hegemony of the West, especially of United States, because the NATO and West are now divided. And the part of building global power of AUKUS was the AUKUS launched the Ukraine-Poland United Kingdom initiative in the last weeks. I think it is very connected with AUKUS, and Poland is an important part of this geostrategy of Anglo-Saxon bloc. But I think we should focus on the very dangerous process which take place in last days. Despite genuine American warnings this time about the possibility of Russian invasion of Ukraine, Poland was rather taken by surprise. The result is the acceptance of refugees from Ukraine, of whom there are already almost 2 million in Poland. In Poland started a total information campaign against Russia with using of censorship and of course defense of Ukraine's so-called freedom and European values. And now let's focus on the main geostrategical issue, whether Poland should take part in the war or not. It is worth to remind that the Second World War also brought out in Poland at Westerplatte, near Gdynia, near Gdańsk. I was born in Gdańsk. So let's listen to the latest information about the MiG-29s, which Poland, Slovakia, and Bulgaria were to hand over to Ukraine because Ukraine first mentioned this possibility. After a few days, it is now clear beyond any doubt that this was not fake news, but someone's attempt to draw Poland into the conflict in Ukraine. Shortly after these revelations were made, the NATO Secretary General appeared in Poland, and President Duda had to denounce the provision of aircraft to the Ukrainians and the use of our airports in the conflict. Later, the plan to hand over the fighters was still demanded by Prime Minister Morawiecki. It is still unclear whose idea it was for Poland to hand over 28 MiG-29 aircrafts. But it seems we did not initially consult the United States on this proposal, and the Ukrainians, wanting to draw NATO into the war, made it public. After Stoltenberg's intervention, contrary to his words, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke about the transfer of the fighters and announced that Poland had the green light to transfer the MiGs. Still, it seemed that some sort of deal was already agreed. On Tuesday, the Polish Foreign Ministry said that Poland would hand over the MiG-29 fighters, but to the Ramstein base, American Ramstein base in Germany, where they could be at the disposal of the United States. And if the American want and collective NATO want, they can hand them over the Ukraine. Additionally, it was declared that we would be willing to buy fighter planes from the United States in their place. It was good, I think, I approve, this was a good step for Poland. But listen what was happening. Poland's declaration shocked the Americans, who declared that they did not want to this mix. Our government wanted to give them our fighters free of charge, but the F-16 American, it would have to buy. And the Americans said they had no offer for Poland. It looks as if the United States had chosen second-rate NATO members such as Poland, Bulgaria, or Slovakia, and is playing them off against each other to possibly start another proxy war with Russia. It is a good thing that Poland proposed such a solution officially with the participation of the media. We were able to test the Americans and at the same time not to put an ally on which our security is based against the war. It could be said that we played on the noses of Russia and the United States at the same time. It should be noted that the Polish administration had to take off the burden of handing over the planes which the US dragged us into by talking about the green light. The risk that the Iskanders and Kalib Russians from Russia will suddenly start flying over Poland, and it is still very high even without the transfers of MiG. One gets the impression that the United States has tried to maneuver Poland into conflict that could lead to the World War. It is easy for the US to tell Poland to send planes directly because they are not neighbors of Russia and Belarus and are not another potential target for the attack. This situation is warning and shows how easy it is become a pawn in the power game of big powers. States have their own interests, and if we cannot defend ourselves, Poland, it is better not to attack the stronger ones. But still there are ideas in Poland to bring our country into the Russian-Ukrainian war. A few days ago, a European delegation visited Kyiv, where it met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal. The delegation included Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, Prime Minister Meter Fajla and Janez Dansa from Slovakia and Czech. And also Polish Deputy Prime Minister for Security, Jarosław Kaczyński. Kaczyński is de facto #1 in politics, in Polish politics. And he called for NATO peacekeeping missions to defend Ukraine against Russia. De facto, it could mean the start of World War III. America, for now, did not support this idea, but the situation of Poland is very far from telling about our security. Thank you for now.
Thank you, Gracjan. Almost 10 minutes. Now, Dragana from Serbia. You remember the bombing of Serbia, of course.
Yes,
So,
for
Dragana,
sure.
your turn.
Yes. Yeah, well, hello to everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to being part of this roundtable. I thank very much the organizers, and also I appreciate very much Mr. Cimek's discussion. Yes, for sure, as all the citizens of that time Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and all citizens of Serbia and Montenegro, I remember NATO bombing of my country. That is also a European country, a sovereign country that did not attack any NATO member state at the time that it was bombed, and a part of our territory was at that time by war taken from us and is now under UN peacekeeping process. But anyway, Kosovo declared unilaterally, as we know, 2008 independence, and all these NATO countries and the whole Western bloc and many other countries recognized that independence, while Serbia, of course, still consider Kosovo and Metohija as its southern province. According to UN Security Council resolution, it is so. Anyway, I will now focus on our today's topic, but I wanted to point out this aspect to show the hypocrisy of the European and global powers that nowadays are shocked that the sovereign European state was attacked, and they are like shocked about breaching the international law, etc., all the things that they were doing. But unlike Russian forces, as far as I can see, what is happening in Ukraine, of course it's tragedy, but I'm not going to talk about it from my personal or emotional position, because it's only important for myself and people around me, not for you or wider audience. I will talk about from geopolitical aspect. But I just wanted to point out the hypocrisy and also some processes that came out of the current situation that are very dangerous. Mr. Cimek already pointed that we live in a totally polarized world, but in many aspects polarized, and there is a less and less space for independent analysis, for independent thinking, or independent political positioning. Like Serbia at the moment is military neutral, and we agreed with UN resolution against Russian military action in Ukraine, but we resisted to introduce sanctions towards Russia for so many reasons, among which are that we are 100% totally dependent on import of Russian gas and oil, and that our oil industry is dominantly owned by Russian corporation, but also from historical and cultural reasons and centuries old close connection connections with Russia. That connection goes to get also towards Ukrainian, but that's another story. Anyway, let me go back to the geopolitics analysis of today's conflict, because if we want to look only on what is happening now, that is not going to explain very much. But we've seen terrible sanctions introduced by Western Bloc that are actually demolishing the existing international monetary order, the existing trade and production chains, and they are not going to solve anything, because basically sanctions are showing that you don't have any policy towards an issue or country, and they are not going to solve anything, and they are just going to jeopardize everybody's chances to recover to pandemics and the previous never-ended global economic crisis. But I would like to speak about Russian position in the globally dominant Western discourse, because for more before we were listening stories about that the Western Bloc is totally against the USSR because it was like the leading communist country, and they were allegedly for pro-democracy, and USSR was like a epitome of like autocratism and communism and etc. So after dissolvement of USSR, we've just heard of Mr. Brzezinski, but they're all similar geopolitical conceptions. They are afraid of Russia re-emerging as an imperial power. So at the same time, while Western Bloc was using all these imperial tools to control the whole world after the dissolvement of Eastern Bloc in USSR, it was just fine and positive, and it was pro-democracy, free economic flows, but in reality, it wasn't at all like that. It was full of neocolonialism, imbalances, full of dozens of proxy wars, several hundreds of military bases, and more and more military alliances, and more selling of weaponry, etc., etc. And whatever Russia was doing was in advance wrong. All that rhetorics, all the negative words that were supposed and could be said about Russia were already said before this war started. Whatever Russia was suggesting, like a common security space from Lisbon to Vladivostok, was just ignored. When Russia suggested and protested against when Bulgaria and Romania were introduced to NATO, and all these for just grasping former Soviet military bases and putting missiles with the medium range missiles with nuclear weaponry heads on it. It was said it was against Iran, but basically they were all turned towards Russia. And as we know, for decades, the whole global public was lied about how Mr. Bush and his administration and the whole Western Bloc did not promise to Mr. Gorbachev that NATO would not expand towards East, while in reality, and now these documents proved, because they were not secret documents anymore, so they proved that they promised and saying NATO would not expand towards the east, which means no more, not for 1 inch further from Western Germany at that point. And that is why, of course, the Soviets accepted to withdraw their force and to dismantle their mechanism of controlling that space. But nevertheless, NATO expanded, but not just towards former Eastern Bloc members, but towards also former USSR member states like Baltic states. And Ukraine, as we know from history, was that piece of soil from where terrestrial invasion towards Russia was always done, either by Napoleon's army or Western German army in the Second World War. So Ukrainian position in Russian history, but Russia was denied not just the right to re-establish itself as a global power. If we want to look at the world map, you see that huge state, but the Western world kept saying it is not a global power. It doesn't have the rights of other global power, to has its sphere of interest, to protect its interest. Only USA has the right to take these so-called preemptive attacks or pre-preemptive attacks. Some things and many things in our world are only to be used by most powerful Western state, but never Russia. From my analysis, I see that Russia was denied its right to be a great power. Its cultural influence, it was even racially, on a racial basis, this looked minimized, tried to really minimize the influence, the value of Russia as a civilization, as a nation that gave a lot. When we see now that the Western world is forbidding Dostoevsky or maybe dead Russian composers or living Russian conductors and Paralympics and cats and dogs.
Yes, even the cats, yes.
Yes, and recently I read the announcement of the female rector of Universidad de Valencia, like Spanish University of Valencia. The lady was saying all Russian students should go away. If they stay, it will be upon their own responsibility. What is it, or what is the world we live on has become? Is it like sort of a Nazism? It's the Western world united in hatred towards Russia. So I'm totally protesting against the world where we have to unite to hate one country, one nation. We have to hate Russian sportsmen and sportswomen and everything. I'm like a Slavic person like Mr. Cimek, but those intelligent guys who just can just mismatch me for a Russian person. So what should it happen? Like they should attack me because I look or sound Russian. What is the next step? They also just put their hands on the Russian state deposits of Russian foreign currency deposits in their banks. It is a robbery. How can you do that? Who will, but anyway, it's another story about how they are dismantling the world they've been running actually, and how they've been dismantling dollar as a leading global currency. It's another story. But I would like to point out that Russia has been denied great power rights and legitimate security threat with Ukrainian, with such a government under strong influence of these neo-Nazi forces, with their own military forces, with in a country where state of Ukrainian has been forging a war against its own people in Donbas region for 7 years, and there have been something like 14,000 dead people, and there was not a single word about that in Western press. Nobody cared because they don't care. Because only particular victims are important, and in such approach, only particular victims should be mourned and should be taken care of. Other victims, as that American politician in conversation with Ukrainian parliamentary said, but these people have blonde hair and blue eyes, so they're not these, dark hair, dark skin and complexion and this and that nationality. These people deserve our attention and care and your support. And this American genius said, yeah, these people in Ukraine, they're really with the blonde hair and blue eyes, and they're almost civilized.
Yes, we will come back. We will come back, Dragana. It's already more than 10 minutes. Okay,
Sorry,
we will come back. You will have
Thank
time
you.
later. Okay, Now we go to Austria. Professor Köchler, please activate your
Yes, it is.
microphone. Yes.
It is activated. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Vienna. You have asked us to speak about what peaceful coexistence could be envisaged in that particular situation between the two countries of Russia and Ukraine. I fully agree with the previous speaker, Professor Mitrovic, in regard to what she said about double standards and the lack of credibility of the Western world in dealing with this conflict. I would add, it is not true that a new era has now begun on the 24th of February when Russia invaded Ukraine, that a new era in international relations has begun. It is not true. Everybody says it in the West, the American president, the German prime minister, and practically all the other Western leaders. What is true, however, is that a new era has begun after 1990 with all the acts of unilateral coercion and military aggression by the United States, NATO, and other Western allies all over the world. Let's just mention what happened in Europe, in Yugoslavia in '99, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, and so on. That was the paradigm change. After the power balance of the Cold War had ended, there were no restraints anymore on the part of the United States and her allies. And one just has to be truthful about the historical facts if one wants to evaluate the situation at the moment. As far as the actual situation is concerned, we also must admit two basic facts domestically and internationally. First, the present conflict is also a legacy of the unconstitutional regime change or coup d'etat in 2014 in Ukraine. A regime change or a coup that was massively supported from abroad, particularly the United States and some other Western countries. That was, of course, outright interference into the internal affairs of Ukraine. Second point, internationally, unfortunately, the United Nations system of collective security is dysfunctional in this particular case, simply because of the direct involvement of permanent members of the Security Council. The United Nations can do effectively nothing. It can provide a kind of forum for the meetings and debates in the chambers of the Security Council and in the General Assembly. But in terms of resolution of the conflict, the UN is paralyzed. But that is a fact of the structure of the organization. It was constructed like that. It cannot act effectively whenever at least one permanent member is involved in a dispute. For that reason, the only way forward is now for the two sides, Russia and Ukraine, to seek political compromise. Compromise that will be painful for both sides, but it will be absolutely necessary. First, in order to restore peace in Ukraine and to create a basis for sustainable peace, and secondly, also to preserve peace at the global level. Many people, mainly in the West now, are speaking about the threat also of nuclear war. So let me just very briefly, in the form of bullet points, make a few statements about what I would envisage as someone observing the developments from outside, but from nearby. By the way, Ukraine is closer to Vienna than our western city of Bregenz is. I mean, we are geographically quite close by, and we are carefully observing the developments. As far as Ukraine is concerned, I just can reiterate what I said on behalf of the International Progress Organization. It's now 7 years ago, on the 12th of February 2015, when in Minsk they had agreed on certain measures to resolve the conflict. Namely, that Ukraine should realize or should accept the fact that Ukraine is not a uniform nation state. Ukraine is a multi-ethnic state, and any policy that will artificially try to create a kind of homogeneous state in terms of language and culture will just fail and will destabilize the country. And that's what we have seen. So for that reason, Ukraine should have implemented the provisions the president of Ukraine had agreed to already in Minsk about constitutional reform of the country towards a more federal state system and with meaningful autonomy for the eastern provinces, for the two eastern provinces where there is a Russian-speaking majority. One could, by the way, also study the experience Austria had in terms of the Austrian German-speaking minority in Italy. There was even a kind of insurgency in the German-speaking territory of Italy, which is part of, which is the southern part of Tyrol. And that problem had been resolved between the Republic of Austria and the Republic of Italy on the basis of a autonomy agreement. And let me just stop for one moment. I have to check here some technical matter. Just one moment, maybe 10 seconds, please.
Yes, I just remind some of you that Professor Köchler had sent us his text of the statement of the International Progress Organization on the Minsk Agreement. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, now that issue is resolved. So the idea would be that Ukraine should seriously consider to fully implement what they had agreed to anyway in Minsk, under Minsk II in 2015, namely to provide adequate rights of self-rule to the people in the eastern parts of the country. And they had already agreed in Minsk, by the way, on a kind of package of measures which is rather similar to what Austria has agreed upon with Italy concerning the status of the German-speaking South Tyroleans in terms of judiciary, in terms of language, in terms of education, and so on. They never did, and so that's how the situation escalated domestically and vis-à-vis the Russian Federation. Second point I would like to mention concerning Ukraine is also what I emphasized for the IPO in 2015, namely that the country should consider a status of permanent neutrality according to international law. Again, there is the example of Austria. Austria was occupied by the four Allied powers after the Second World War. And for us, the way to gain independence and to establish the state as an internationally recognized state and with sufficient security guarantees was that Austria committed itself to be permanently neutral, not only neutral in particular situations, but as a matter, as a kind of state principle. And that Austria has had this status exactly since the year 1955, and the neutrality law was adopted as a constitutional amendment to the Constitution of the Republic of Austria by the Austrian Parliament. Something similar should and could be envisaged by Ukraine, and now we see or we hear that this neutrality question or neutrality topic has been brought up also initially even by the president of Ukraine, and is now also mentioned by the Russian side in their peace negotiations. The third point concerning Ukraine, I just would mention very briefly, is that in order to build an atmosphere of peace, the country should also abolish any anti-Russian measures as far as the entire territory of the country is concerned, in terms of language and so on. As far as Russia is concerned, just very briefly, I would also mention 3 points. First, there is no way or it is absolutely required that Russia accepts the Republic of Ukraine as a sovereign state, member state of the United Nations with distinct national identity, and adequate security guarantees have to be given to the country in terms of its territorial integrity. We have seen that the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, unfortunately, was not worth the paper on which it was written, because this memorandum would have guaranteed security to Ukraine. But the language, by the way, is ambiguous. In the official English version, I saw that they do not use the term guarantee, but instead assurances. But assurance is something not binding. And anyway, this memorandum has not been ratified by the legislators of those states that signed it. It was simply signed by the governmental delegations, and that's certainly not good enough in regard to the international status of a country. Second point, unfortunately, it seems to be too late now, but in my view, still, Russia should consider to return to the Minsk agreements. Russia, over all these years, insisted so much that these agreements should be implemented in full, especially as regards the autonomy of the Eastern territories. So I do not see any way out if one is now totally just ignoring the Minsk agreements and the unilateral secession of the 2 eastern provinces, which happened right now with the unilateral recognition, by Russia of 2 eastern territories, is not valid in terms of international law. It is not good enough if there are 2 territories that are recognized by one single country out of almost 200 member states of the United Nations. So that is not a sound basis to go forward. And third, as far as the situation in the Crimean Peninsula is concerned, as far as I can see, or the historical fact is that this territory was historically, for a long period of time, part of Russia. Only recently, it had been given, so to speak, as a gift by one of its sons, namely Nikita Khrushchev, to Ukraine. So in order to solve that issue on a transparent basis, in my view, what would be important is, because the status of Crimea is still not internationally recognized, and the majority of the member states of the United Nations does not recognize this secession. What would be necessary is a kind of popular referendum under international auspices of, let's say, the United Nations and or of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, so that it would be very clear what the choice of the people who live there really is. And so that one could then claim that this is something that is based on the right of self-determination. I think I should not speak any longer. And just one last sentence. In the medium term, after this terrible catastrophe, and after all these other catastrophes that happened in Iraq, by the way, one is almost forgetting also Yemen, where there is also a brutal and terrible war and aggression. After all these tragedies, the world really, the community of nations, and I mean all nations, not just the Western nations who arrogantly always claim that they are the community of nations must get together and seriously think about a new global security architecture, because the United Nations at the moment is paralyzed. And it is here where I see also a crucial role for the non-aligned movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Köchler. You speak more than 10 minutes. Well, so everybody speaks more than 10 minutes. It means that the request of Dimitris is justified. Dimitris, now we go to Greece. Dimitris.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants. I'm afraid, yes, I will try to be as short as possible, and probably afterwards we can continue.
Yes, you can come back after.
My intervention is divided into two parts. One, some short keys to interpret the current situation in Ukraine, and the second, where we're going from now on. To understand what is going on in Ukraine, we must absolutely put this crisis into its historical and its international context. Otherwise, we don't understand anything if we judge it as a local, so to say, clash between Russia and Ukraine. First of all, I want to remind you that there are three defining experiences, three historical experiences which define the kernel of the Russian collective unconscious and consciousness also, and especially of the Russian popular classes and of the Russian state elites. The three defining experiences are the three efforts of the West to destroy the Russian state. The two of them during the last 2 centuries. One was Napoleon's effort. The second was Hitler's effort. Both of them have used military means. Their armies passed through Ukraine and Belarus. The third one, by other means, was what the International Monetary Fund, in alliance with a part of the ex-Soviet nomenclatura, has done after 1990. I remind you that the so-called economic reforms have provoked the biggest, by far the biggest economic and social disaster in all the history of the industrial era. And after INF, it came NATO, which has begun to absorb one by one the ex-Soviet republics. Also, we must return to the fact that the Soviet Union itself was dissolved in rather by a coup d'etat by Yeltsin in 1991, against the will of the majority of the Soviet citizens, which was expressed of the crushing majority of the Russian of the Soviet citizens, as expressed in the referendum of 1991. And it was also dissolved without taking into account any ethnological, national, or historical reality. Like in Yugoslavia, the dissolution gave birth to new post-Soviet states with absolutely arbitrary frontiers. Large groups of compact groups of different Soviet nations, including Russians, have been included in states which were affiliated to other nationalities. Like, for instance, in Ukraine, this happened with Crimea and with Donbass and Lugansk, which were the overwhelming majority was of Russian nationality. And this has not happened only with Russians, and this was the reason that we have 10 wars before even Ukraine inside the ex-Soviet Union. But there is an international context here. We must remember that the reunification of Germany and the retreat of the Soviet Union from Eastern Europe, upon its own initiative, was done on the promise of the West not to expand NATO 1 inch. Now the West is saying that NATO is a purely defensive alliance and it is not harming anybody, but I don't think any serious person would see the most formidable military alliance of history going farther and farther to the east without getting anxious. I remind also that after 1990, a series of countries which were friendly or allied with Russia were destroyed, were bombed, were invaded in full without taking into account at all the international law. To speak now of international law, but making somehow abstraction of what has happened during 30 years of in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and in many other cases, it is sheer hypocrisy. This is not international law. This is the law of the stronger, who is now saying, all right, if you do not apply when I want the international law, you will be punished. I have also to remind you that it was already said that in 2014 there was a coup d'etat supported by CIA, by the United States government in Kiev, and which is directly at the origin of what has happened since and what is happening now. I have also to remind you that all the main arms control treaties, which were signed between the United States and the Soviet Union and the United States and Russia subsequently, and which were aiming at avoiding a nuclear war, have, except for one, the start concerning the strategic nuclear arms treaty, concerning the strategic nuclear arms, the United States have retreated from those treaties, which can be interpreted, is a normal interpretation, that they prepare to wage a nuclear war, and this is why they are not interested in having any chunks of their nuclear armaments. By the way, one of those treaties was the Treaty for Intermediary Nuclear Forces in Europe, and now we see that America is putting more of those extremely destabilizing weapons, including anti-ballistic missiles in Eastern Europe. During the Trump administration, I remind you that also the strategic doctrine of the United States has changed, and instead of terrorism, which is an euphemism for Islam, now the main opponents of the United States of America are Russia and China. as an analyst have said, we have gone from the ever-ending wars of President Obama to the preparation of the cataclysmic wars. By the way, American strategies, including Brzezinski, have not hidden their strategy of using Ukraine against Russia and also of dismembering the Russian Federation, as Brzezinski has written in his book on the Grand Échiquier. I don't know, the Great Chessboard, I think, in English. So if we take all this into account, of course, there is an aggression of Russia against Ukraine on the local level, but this is just the expression of a much larger conflict, which is a conflict initiated by NATO and the West against Russia, and in prospect against China, Iran, and I think everybody else. But this is, even this is not enough to explain what is going on now, and which is in reality the beginning, the opening of a third world war. I don't know if this will take a nuclear form and will lead to the annihilation of mankind. It's a probability, but it is obvious that we have already all the measures which are corresponding to a situation of world war, economic, except direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia forces because of the existence of nuclear weapons. Such a situation did not fall from the sky. It has fallen from the fact that we are living in a deep economic crisis of Western capitalist system, which began in 2008 and which is of a similar depth with the other huge crisis of the end of 19th century and of 1929, which led, as we remember, to the two world wars, to big revolutions and counter-revolutions, who are essentially in a phenomenon of this magnitude and of this order. And this can explain why, not the direct, so to say, reasons, but the fundamental reasons we are going now towards a situation where in the opening of a situation towards a new world war. Of course, this crisis, this economic crisis is combined with two other crises of Western capitalism. That is the fact that there is a series of emerging powers, including Russia, especially in the military field, China, in the economic field, and other powers which come after, which put in doubt the possibility of the West to dominate the planet, including the role of the dollar, that is the possibility of the United States of America to finance their economy by use of the role of the dollar internationally. And also we have to add to this the terminal ecological crisis we're confronting. So I will not go more into the reasons of this situation, but I want to draw now the two, so to say, ways to try to describe the two ways we have in front of us. The one possibility is that NATO continues to provide armaments to Ukrainians in the hope that it will make Russia bleed forever, to continue the campaign of demonization of Russia, which is taking even appalling forms of McCarthyism in the West, and also of a kind of national pogrom against Russians, of international pogrom against Russians because they are Russians, not because they have some other quality which we have not seen in Europe since the persecution of Jews and Roma 1 century ago. Of course, we are not still in the same forms of persecution, but the rule of demonizing people because they belong to a given nationality is already in place. The economic sanctions which were imposed in Russia are obviously a way to destroy Russian economy and to have a regime change. This method did not have results even when it was applied to much less strong countries than Russia, like North Korea, like Iraq, like Iran, like Cuba, like Syria. But when you apply this to Russia, when you try by such means to have a regime change in Russia, as Mr. Soros suddenly recently said, we need to overthrow Putin and see, we are in front of a definite and serious risk of provoking a nuclear war, which will be the end of everything. I believe, but I don't want to make abuse of the time here. If you want, we can discuss it later.
Yes, you can
We
discuss
are
later.
now at a point which is much more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, for reasons that if you want, I can explain.
Yeah.
Even if we avoid the nuclear catastrophe, which is not sure, it is impossible in such conditions to avoid the climatic and the other technogenic disasters which are coming. For instance, scientists have warned us that during the few next years, we need to take very radical measures to invert the climatic change. Otherwise, the Earth will go to another climate trajectory, which is unsustainable with life on Earth. But we cannot do this. This is extremely difficult anyway, but it is impossible to do it in an environment of cold or hot wars. And it is impossible to do it if we transfer massively all resources to the acquirements of new armaments like the ones that Germany is now acquiring.
Okay.
I am finishing, Darvish.
Yes. Okay.
So the other way ahead is to push and to press for a kind of compromise in Ukraine, which has to include the idea of neutrality of this country, of practical conditions which will assure Russia of not having to be anxious of an attack from the Ukrainian soil, which is a quite logical demand. And also Moscow has to recognize the legitimate rights of the Ukrainian people, its national identity and its particular historical course. It will be a terrible mistake of Moscow if they underestimate the power of the national feeling of Ukrainians, as Americans have underestimated the power of the national feelings of Russians. And it will be a terrible mistake of Ukraine if it continues to invest in becoming the forefront of the war of NATO against Russia. A last remark. During the last 30 years, the resistance of the peoples in Yugoslavia and the Middle East to the neocolonial wars that West has begun. The fact that Russia was not dismembered as Mr. Brzezinski and other American strategists were planning. the fact that China has now its power has grown, has made impossible the realization of the dream of 1990 for an eternal empire of the international financial capital and of America, which was essentially what was said like the end of history. But with the productive forces and the technologies we have after 1945, there is not the possibility of winning such a war, neither for the West or the East, neither for North or South. This is why I consider the most critical factor, even for the very survival of mankind, the effort to organize the popular classes of the West, the forces which are for the independence of Europe and the global South, and to intervene in this ongoing conflict in order to found a new multipolar, democratic, social, and ecological world order. And if you agree, I would propose that we draft a kind of appeal, and we think of what other initiatives we may take. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dimitris. Yes, it is in the same direction, orientation of our meeting, that we will come out, but we will form a kind of small group, working group, to draft a statement, something like that. Well, also you have shared some of the elements presented by Hans Köchler, including neutrality, recognition of Russia on Ukraine, etc., etc. That's very good. And also, who will manage all this? I mean, the question of Bandung that I presented since the beginning. Let us take back. I mean, let us take back Ukraine. But who is taking back? Is UN, people of Russia, or people of Ukraine, or all of us? That is the question still. Now we go to France. Bruno, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready, and hello everybody, and thank you for this occasion to talk. A lot of things have already been said, so I will try to stress on the more important ones I can talk about. So I will begin with an obvious fact, but we have to repeat it and repeat it, that Ukraine crisis has to be put in the general context of the world situation and cannot be analyzed separately, as a lot of people try to do. We are in a situation in the world with what we can call the growing counter-hegemony trends, which are developing in very different countries with very different social systems, but which can be called counter-hegemony. We have very different countries like Russia, like North Korea, like China, like Cuba, like Iran, with a lot of different political and ideological system, but all those countries have one thing in common, that they are participating in a growing counter-hegemony movement, which is growing, and then of course it's a challenge for the centralized unipolar world. And the Ukraine crisis has to be seen and observed and analyzed in this context, where there is an attempt to create a new world balance of power, different from the one we experienced during the last 30 years after the end of the Cold War. The new world balance of power is, of course, a new world balance of power on the military aspect, but also on the economical aspect. And one of the main contradictions we have to observe is the contradiction growing between what I would call the productive industrial and agricultural productive states on one side, in contradiction with the rather, I would call them virtual financial and strictly military production states. Mostly the counter-hegemony countries are countries which are trying to develop industrial and agricultural production, when the Western countries are rather tending to develop virtual financial economy and military economy. And that's very important, because it's in this situation we observe the rebirth of the non-aligned movement and on the non-aligned ideology, and we have the contradiction between the countries tending toward unipolarity and countries tending toward multipolarity. And in this context, we have to understand that the actual situation, the current situation, is not only a contradiction between the global South or between Eurasia, Asia, and the Western world. It's also a contradiction between United States and European countries. I will remember, maybe it's not very polite, but I will remember the word Victoria Nuland told during the Maidan so-called revolution in 2014, fuck the EU. And it's very important, because the result of that was that the treaty signed just a couple of days later by Ukrainian government and Ukrainian opposition under the influence of Western European countries and Russia to solve the Ukrainian situation, was violated a couple of hours later under the influence of the United States, which organized the coup in Kiev in 2014, beginning the war in Ukraine, because the war began in 2014. That's one aspect. The second aspect, the second moment was the Minsk agreement, which was also a moment where Western European countries and Russia agreed to find a solution to the Ukrainian crisis without the United States. And of course, the United States pushed Ukraine to sabotage this Minsk agreement. And so we have a situation, if we observe all the situation between Atlantic and Pacific, we have a growing trend toward what I would call a growing big Eurasian economical integration from Eastern Asia up to Western Europe. And this trend is contradictory with the trend of maintaining North Atlantic bloc, which was created during the Cold War. And we have a lot of crises that appeared between, let's say, Germany and Korea, all over the past 30 years. I will remember you, of course, Ukraine, but Belarus, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Korea, and a lot of other crises. And all these crises have one thing in common: they block or delay, at least, the objective process of economical integration from eastern shores of Asia up to western shores of North Atlantic. It is an objective economical process, and that's why I consider that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine now is not only a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. It's not only a conflict between West and Russia. It's also a conflict between United States and Western Europe, especially Germany. Because in Germany, we have two trends. We have one trend which is linked with the, let's say, the German administration created by the Americans after the Second World War, mainly on the basis of former Nazi. And we have the German industry, which has interest to develop ties with Eurasia and Asia. And the trends of Germany and Europe for cooperation with Eurasian and Asian nations has to be blocked, because if it's not blocked, the United States would become a peripheral country in the world situation. And they, of course, as a decaying power, cannot accept that, and they will fight as long as possible by any means they can to survive as the only unipolar power, even if objectively we see that it's an era finishing. That's one thing. And the second thing, now I'm coming to Ukraine. Ukraine in that situation is a territory, I would say rather a territory than a country. I would like Ukraine would be a country or a state, but for a moment it's just a territory. Because if we observe the situation in Ukraine, apart from slogan, we must observe that Ukraine is not a liberal democratical state. It's a purely oligarchic state with political repression and bannings. The human rights in Ukraine has nothing to do with the so-called European values advocated by the West in a rather hypocritical way, by the way. So we have to understand, and it's very important, because if we assume the fact that Ukraine is not a really liberal democratic state, the war between Ukraine and Russia cannot be considered as a war between democracy and, let's say, autocratic Russia, but it's a war between two states having a different system explaining why the war is happening. In fact, of course, in Ukraine, you have strong nationalism, you have nazism, you have Russophobia, and you have all these elements which are occupying the place. But behind, we have to ask why the leading classes in Ukraine are siding with the United States against Russia, and why they wanted to join NATO, pushing their country in war, which is, of course, an aggression to Russia. I just want to remember that a NATO missile base in Ukraine would mean that Moscow would be at 4 minutes from the missile base. It means it would give no chance for Russians to answer to such an attack. So it's obvious that Ukraine cannot be, from the Russian point of view, whatever you think about the Russian government, Ukraine cannot be a NATO member, cannot belong to an alliance which is considered as a threat to Russian security. So why Ukrainian governments are so anti-Russian, and why they behave in such a way from 2014, remembering they began the war against their Russian-speaking minority at that time. We have to observe that, of course, it's a very quick definition I give, but if we compare the political system of Russia and the political system of Ukraine, we can understand one of the roots of this war, because I would say that Russia is something like a vertical oligarchistic system integrated with Eurasia and with development, with production development policies. And it means that oligarchs in Russia are still very important, but to a certain extent, they are partly domesticated from the Putin era by the political power. The situation in Ukraine is completely different. The situation in Ukraine is exactly the situation we had in Russia during the Yeltsin times. It was a horizontal oligarchic system in which the presidents, the Yeltsin in Russia or the Ukrainian presidents up to now, are just puppets of the oligarchs. So it's horizontal. It means you have oligarchs who are leading the country, pretending to be democrats, but in fact they are not democrats. They are leading the country. They are creating political parties. When political parties are too dangerous for them, they just forbid these parties, like it was done with two very important parties in Ukraine. They are just forbidden. And so the so-called elections are elections between oligarchic parties. the only ones, but they are competing because they represent different oligarchs. And this situation explains why the Ukrainian oligarchs don't want to have the Russian systems, because in the Russian system, they would have to pay more tax, and they will have to not interfere in the political life as they did at the Yeltsin time, or as they still do in Ukraine. So the situation now in Ukraine will be solved for economical reason. It means the oligarchy in Ukraine has lost a lot of money for the last months, not only the war ones, because as already in the autumn of the late year, the situation in Ukraine was bad, and the Ukrainian money devaluated, and the foreign investments were taken back out of Ukraine. So the oligarchs lost a lot of money before the war, and now with the war, they are losing much more. So their interest now is rather to let's say, to give peace a chance, not, of course, to promote in Ukraine a democracy or whatever you want, not to destroy Russia, but to find a compromise in which they can hold their position of plunderers of their country, but with something like a system in the middle of the road between the Yeltsin system and the Putin system, between the nowadays Ukrainian system and the Russian system. In this situation, of course, we have to ask if the United States would accept this. And this is very important because, of course, the United States will not allow any compromise in Ukraine, any peace deal in Ukraine. But, of course, the United States are not wanting to finance the war. They don't want to finance the war. They want the Europeans to finance the war. So the question and the main issue now is, do the European leading classes will accept to be the instrument of Americans to finance a war, so the Ukrainian oligarchs will accept to be on the Western side, or will Europe develop something, or European countries develop something as a more non-aligned policy that will promote some compromise and some peace in Ukraine. But because the situation of Ukraine, and I will finish on that, is a catastrophe, not only now. I mean, if you look at the economical situation of Ukraine now, Ukraine has, for example, Ukraine now, when Ukraine became independent in 1991, the economical level of Ukraine was more or less the same like the economical level of Belarus. Now the economical level of Ukraine is half the one of Belarus. Because of course we had a completely different policy in Belarus and in completely different policy in Ukraine. In Belarus, we have a more economically productivist and socially oriented economy. In Ukraine, we have a plundering economy, like we had in Russia in the 90s. But in the tragedy of Ukraine is that this policy is still carried on in Ukraine, when in Russia, in spite of all critics we can do to the oligarchic system of Russia, we have still a situation where there is something like a national state, some regulation of the economy and some productive policies that made possible, for example, Russia to be exporter of agricultural products, which was not the case earlier. And that's the situation where the Ukraine now is in very tragic situation. And I think we are at the end of the road. I mean, the economy of Ukraine cannot survive anymore, even if peace is back with the current system. It has to be changed, and I think that the Russian, but also the Ukrainian, more clever negotiators are understanding that situation, and they know that there should be a compromise, even if I would say the American the United States will do everything they can to stop a compromise in Ukraine, because a compromise in Ukraine would mean peace, and peace would mean more earlier or later Eurasian integration from Atlantic up to Pacific, from Brest and Lisbon up to Peking, Pyongyang, and Seoul. And this is unbearable for the new peripheral empire, which is the United States.
Thank you, Bruno. Yeah, there are several points that very well we shared. For example, non-alignment, etc. And also interesting that the oligarch in Ukraine do not want to be domesticated like in Russia. Ukraine cannot domesticate the oligarch, but also that well, as I showed in the on the slides, that the military project of US is that Europe is a part of the territory to be conquered. I mean, China, Russia, and Europe is territory to be conquered by United States. Now, well, you have spoken more than 15 minutes. So finally, everybody speaks more than 15 minutes or around 15 minutes. Now let's go to China. Let's go to Asia. Tiguang, are you there?
Yep. Yes, I am.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'll try to be short.
Yes, good. Okay, let's go.
I speak against imperialism. In specific, the most recent liberal imperialism and the hegemonic order that it created, manufactured through violence, through military means, through finance, through culture means. And this type of imperialism I'm speaking about derives from from Lenin. I strongly believe that we need to be reminded about the Leninist rhetoric on imperialism, and particularly the connection between imperialism and capitalism. As a Chinese who live in the UK and work in the UK, I'm currently bombarded by the amount of information, the animosity against Russian, the racist discourse against the Russian, and the narrative that is purely Western-centric, arguing that this is the turning moment in human history, that the war between Ukraine and Russia, as if this is something that has never happened in the world before. This is hypocrisy, and this is ahistorical. We don't need to be reminded that the current liberal imperialist world order didn't start from this moment. It started from 1990s, or as we say, the warpath of the liberal imperialist order. The new warpath of the liberal imperialist order started in the 1990s. Immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, we've seen the Americans took the warpath in Iraq. Immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, we saw that the Americans took the war, and the NATO took the warpath in Bosnia. These are two monumental wars happened in Europe, in Middle East, right after the so-called the stability, the hegemonic stability was being upset. And the United States and the liberal imperialist world order didn't wait a second to move into the so-called vacuum of power. And yet the rhetoric of liberal imperialist order is accompanied by a series of promises saying that the liberal imperialist world order will bring prosperity to the world, a promise that the world peace will be secured as long as everyone follows the same rule, a promise that is pretended to be called globalization. But in reality, we've seen that the liberal imperialist world order is benefiting from all sorts of stability. First and foremost, a European on fire. And then secondly, we've seen repeatedly as unstable and weak Africa, Latin America, and Middle East. The weak and small countries across the world, the instability across the major continents, Eurasia continent, is the lifeline of that liberal imperial world order. And I strongly believe that the way to combat against this liberal imperialist world order is the unity of those small, or were deemed as small and weak countries. After all, we have to recognize that the liberal imperialist world order is an empire of the minority. It is a world order that is only championed and benefiting a small amount of elites. And repeatedly, we've seen the power of those elite politics could do to the voiceless people. In recent days, as I said, I've been bombarded by the information that Russia needs to be hated and Putin is mad. You can almost imagine they're doing the same thing to the Chinese. You pretty much have already seen the calamity that has been brought forward by the COVID issue, showing to the entire world that one country, one group of people needs to be solely responsible for the damage of a certain virus, rather than portraying this as a combat between mankind and virus. This rhetoric will only get stronger if we ignore the fact that the hegemonic dominance of the liberal imperialist order is manifested through many layers. The layer of finance, as we can see, as well as the layer of culture. Unfortunately, we all need to express our opinion and concerns through a common language. And at the moment, that common language is not common at all, because fundamentally through this, I won't call it a fallout, but through the result of the unilateral sanction, the cultural war against Russia, we can see that information is also dominated by platform that is solely controlled by capital. And it is eventually that boils to the issue that capitalism is our common enemy. Capitalism, just like Bruno said in his talk, became something in Russia, in Ukraine, became something like a parasite that prives from the calamity and the unfortunate situation in a weak country. Capitalism, international capitalism, global capitalism also prey on the small and weak countries in Latin America and Africa. So therefore, I would argue in the end that in order to combat the recent event of Russia and Ukraine war has been repeatedly discussed as the beginning of a different era, I would say yes, but in a sense that it is the beginning of a new political momentum of non-alliance movement. This war reminds us that instead of stepping into different camps and aligning us with blocs, just like the American media, Anglo-American media was trying desperately to bring everybody in line with their opinion, we want to maintain our non-alliance, maintain our independence, and maintain our perspective towards peace, solving global conflicts through peaceful means. And as a Chinese citizen, I strongly support the stand articulated by the Chinese officials, as well as many of the third world countries, that we should not put fuel repeatedly on this war. We should not inject weapons and military supports into this war. Instead, we should bring everybody back to the negotiation table. We should maintain and respect the Minsk Treaty. We should always resolve the situation with peaceful means. And by doing that, I think that as an intellectual, the way that I can contribute in this combat against imperialism is not to align myself in any of the blocs that was advocated by the liberal imperialist media outlets. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, thank you. You are the less time speaker. Okay, that's very good. 9 minutes. Well, and some words repeating. I mean, coming back, non-aligned movement. It is interesting because China was not in non-aligned movement, but I hear from the radio, from television, CGTN, the discourses of the Chinese government is non-alliance, not non-alignment, but non-alliance. Now we go to India, one of the promoter, founder of non-aligned movement. Manu.
Thank you. Really, I would like to first of all state my view, then the official Indian view, with which I don't fully agree, partly only I agree, and then the civil society discourse, which reflects a range of opinions, and then perhaps submit a suggestion, a very general one. First of all, in my view, and I would like to put it as strongly as possible, I think our struggle against imperialism and the US-led hegemonic world order has been weakened by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am a founding member of the Russia-India-China Academic Forum, which proposed, their RIC, and we have been ardent supporters of the BRICS. And in BRICS discourse, we have a vision for the future, which is to replace the imperialist system, the neocolonial system of domination since the 1945 days, and also especially the unilateral US-led system since 1990, with a new democratic participatory order that the Bandung Declaration had promised. And I think that movement today sees a great threat by this particular action, which is provoked by imperialist and neocolonial and hegemonic actions by the US. And from 2014 onwards, it has become even more so, but more so since Vietnam to Iraq, Yemen, so many friends have already mentioned, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and so on. Therefore, I think we need the Bandung spirit. We need independent, moral, political voices that can contribute to a new world public opinion for a democratic security structure, particularly to protect the weak and small states, but also to have not what we are beginning to see, the re-emergence of balance of terror, the kind of nuclear threats and the destructions and the precision bombing that US used to have from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan, and that Russia is claiming to have now. I think, the new war of terror, not just a Cold War, it is a new war of terror, which is now emerging as a result of this. Now, so that's basically my view, in which I believe, and I agree with so many of the preceding friends, reaffirm peaceful coexistence, disapprove invasion, reaffirm territorial integrity of Ukraine, reaffirm the need for multi-ethnic, pluralist Ukraine, so that the Russian-speaking areas are autonomous and they have self-determination within the Republic of Ukraine. And not autocracy, but democracy and human rights and pluralism and genuine competitive politics in Ukraine, not the oligarch-dominated political process as it is now. And therefore, and what is frightening is the new powerful coming together of Russia and China is leading us towards new superpowers, either sharing or replacing earlier superpowers. We want a world without superpowers. We thought Russia, China, with their new strength, will be committed to the values of non-alignment, Bandung, and the Leninist perspective of peaceful coexistence, self-determination, and peace that socialism has the vision for. Therefore, we need a moral political initiative by the Bandung forces. Now, the Indian government has abstained. It has taken a so-called neutral stand, though increasingly its language has changed. It has, in principle, disapproved military intervention in across the borders, etc. But it has abstained in UN Security Council, UN General Assembly, Human Rights Council, and yesterday the International Court of Justice member, the Indian judge, also voted with 13 other judges, asking for Russian withdrawal, ceasefire and withdrawal. And only 2 judges, Russian and Chinese judges, disagreed with the majority decision. And today, we have the news that there is a new rupee deal for gas, a huge gas deal, which is extremely essential for Indian energy supply. And a very good news is that the Russian foreign minister is visiting South Asia, including India. And therefore, we hope that the deadlocked border talks will have some progress, because BRICS is due to meet, and also RIC will meet in China this year. Hopefully by then, India-China relations would have improved so that Prime Minister Modi can visit personally China. So these are some good news, but I do not support this neutral position, though the government of India says it has the 3 following reasons. 1, 20,000 Indian students had to be evacuated. And I'm glad to note that except a dozen or so, the students have been evacuated, some through the Russian corridor, some through Poland, Belarus, and so on. Second, we are very, very dependent on Russian defense supplies, the missile defense, S-400 missile defense system, and so many very important supplies. And third, Russian political support on Kashmir in the United Nations and India's many UN aspirations. Russia has given a solidarity position. So these are the views. In my view, we could have still called it Russian invasion and disapproved it, even while abstaining. And I think just as US is not angered by, US is angered, and US disapproved several of our deals with Russia, but US cannot afford to lose Indian support in its so-called Indo-Pacific strategy, which is again a warmongering strategy rather than a cooperative defense strategy. Now, therefore, I think we could have still maintained India, China, Russia, reasonable solidarity while disapproving Russian action, this aggressive action on Ukraine, causing so much humanitarian losses and so many other strategic implications it has. Therefore, that is the Indian government position. Incidentally, the Indian judges' view, with the majority condemning Russian invasion as violation of international law, is described by the Indian Ministry of External Affairs as the judge's personal, judicial view, not the MEA view, not the government view. Now, Indian civil society views have the whole range. I'll give you just one example. Today's Indian Express carries one page on Crimea, how Crimea has developed during the last, since 2014, and Russian ambassadors' photographs, statement, etc. And the opposite page has a brilliant article on, a conversation between a Sten gun wielding Russian soldier in Lviv and a Ukrainian woman offering him sunflower seeds. I think many of you would have seen that video, which is doing viral rounds. The Kafkaesque experience which we are witnessing. In other words, Indian public opinion is very, very divided. Majority condemn the Russian invasion. Many would call it aggression and so on. That is the majority, at least public opinion in the press. But there is also opinion in favor of Russia and in favor of the government. Why government has done what is needed for national interest. But I think while I value the solidarity of this movement and we value the support of China and Russia and the solidarity of India, China and Russia in this movement, but these accents do not support our anti-imperialist and pro-Bandung movement. Finally, my own view again, I think what we need to do is to really defend the principles of Bandung, territorial integrity, non-interference, non-intervention, number one, and democracy, human rights, and pluralism. This is very important, equality of all the linguistic and ethnic people. And this is why the Minsk agreement is so important. And it has been violated both by Russia and by Ukraine. We should point it out. We should organize world public opinion, create a moral political platform to uphold the Bandung principles. So that the present humanitarian tragedy and the ineffectiveness of the United Nations has become so blatantly exposed. Again, in case of US aggression from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Yemen, proxy aggressions and so on, and Lebanon and so on, and now the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we need a global restructuring of the world order through the Bandung Spirit initiatives. I think the urgency of that initiative cannot be exaggerated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mano. It is very related to Bandung. Okay, now we go far away after India, Indonesia. It is the extreme east of this conversation. Connie, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Now,
Okay.
your turn. What is, well, Indonesia, it must be interesting, but under pressure of the West because of now president of G20. Now, let's go.
Okay, thank you, Pak Darwis. I've heard everything just said, and I'm really interested. And I'm not going to repeat what Professor Dragana and then Dimitris and from China, Mr. Ying, because mostly that's what I think. But again, my first thinking that we really have to think, because of this war of Russia and Ukraine, we definitely need to build the world with new equal balance of power. That is a must. If we can go to the 1960, when President Sukarno important speech in the United Nations, that telling to build the world anew, And I think this is about the time that actually Indonesia and other countries should be able to show, either through diplomatically or whatever reason is, hopefully not militarily, to realize this word of peace and running effort. Because from my perspective, the balance of power, like President Sukarno did, it is actually what President Putin now struggling to do it. You know, he is really concerned, in my opinion, he's really concerned about the balance of regional power and the balance of the world power. We have to remember this Bandung principle and the non-alignment movement is a very, very, very important forum. And we have to remember the non-alignment movement is the biggest group of states in the world after the United Nations. When the movement began in 1950, it is really sure that it has to be facing against imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, and so on and so forth. And of course, the foreign aggressions, occupation, dominations, and interference. So I like to remind you, 62 years ago, President Sukarno's speech at the UN Assembly is really telling that the United Nations should act fairly to all the nations. And President Sukarno stated in that meeting that if the Organization of United Nations cannot be fair to every nation in the world, then the world whole will be perhaps disrupted. Because first, if that happens, humanity as a whole will suffer, and a great dream, a great ideal of man will be shattered. And I think President Sukarno at that time reminding us that the United Nations not dealing with words. We have to be very understand with this meaning. United Nations doesn't dealing with words. United Nations deal with men, the dreams of men, the ideas of men, and with the future of all men. So if United Nations cannot act that way, something has to be done to the United Nations. We have to remember that countries attacked by bombing, sabotage, or attempt a government by overthrow since World War II, I think it's around 52 wars since 1945 up to 2013, and mostly run by United States. And that one, I was like asking, what sanctions the world has given or issued to the United States or the POTUS, the President of the United States? Because today, I think Putin is really suffering, the Russians really suffering of all the sanctions, which is, I think, against humanity, against among cats, against trees, and against dogs. I think it's too much already. Now let me tell you that in my thinking, the instrument of national power, which is on dime, diplomatic, information, military, and economic, I think President Sukarno's position during 1960, he really underlined on the diplomatic standpoint. But talking about Putin, what is the word or US or the Europe or Western country give to Putin position? The informational system, the military, the diplomatic and the economic instrument of national power is been abused already. So I think Putin has a very difficult situation, and then he tried to push the military instrument, the only instrument that he can push, because since 1994 he get all this sanction, which is very hard. So three elements of power being closed. Then of course he doesn't have too much room to move. Russia requests legal guarantee. There's no response. I just want to remind you some of it. NATO and EU financing, even US financing the arming of Ukraine, and all this the world is remain silent. And Russia requests Ukraine to commit to Minsk I, Minsk II, Budapest agreement, and of course there's nothing happened. And 2008, definitely Russia tell everyone, that especially NATO, never ever think to put Ukraine as a NATO base. And maybe the most painful thing is when US sent more than 300 tons of weapons to Ukraine and billions of dollars to Ukraine military. And of course, this EU and the alliances is continue to threaten Russia with other sanctions. And regarding nazism, regarding neo-Nazism and everything that approved by UN resolution number 2002, is actually the Ukraine against it, the Europe abstain, and the UN remains silent. So if I try to remind you of this problem, of course, this year I think Putin has to do something which is actually taking action as a final warning. So the question after this is, are we going to be living in a totally different world? I mean, whatever happens to Russia today is out of my mind. The concept of I think we have to remember what is the President Sukarno belief on his very second important speech regarding berdikari. Berdikari in bahasa in English is the concept of standing on your own feet. Because actually rejecting the ideas of imperialism and neocolonialism. And I think this is the berdikari issue, or standing on your own feet issue. Every country has to really standing on their own feet, because I don't believe it what happened to Russia. I mean, from the Swiss, from the cryptocurrency, the SWIFT case, the ban until 2023, the UN Petro-Arabic countries, and so on and so forth. And according what I think Professor Dragana mentioned about the dog, the food, the dog, the cat, and the trees. Everything's done by Europeans for condemning Russia. So whatever happened today, when $8 trillion of Russians' money is blocking around the world, we have some friends that is a tourist in Bali now. They cannot move everywhere because the SWIFT system is been closed. So this is this is against humanity. How come you do that? So with whatever done by Russia today, I think it's going to bring us to one point. That is the end of the globalization era. We don't believe on globalization anymore, because actually it's destroy us. And whatever done, the sanctions done by countries to Russia, I think a suicidal sanctions. Okay, so I just want to be fast, Pada Ruiz, because we already mentioned this and that. But
Good.
okay, what need? No. Let me finish. Three points. So the word need to be one voice on one. We have to ask the UN neutrality issues. Otherwise, we don't need no UN. Two, pushing NATO and neo-Nazis away from Ukraine. So we have to help Putin to feel safe today, to push away NATO from Ukraine, and again the neo-Nazi things like that. And the last thing is, we have to be united, to all together telling United States to stop the hypocrisy and interfering other nation or other regions' affairs. So because why? Because I think today we have to we learn a lot that how this issue is already come to Taiwan. Out of the blue, people talking about Taiwan. Exactly. Okay, in my opinion, we have to push Taiwan, okay, to just or maybe sit with Taiwan, not push, sit with Taiwan and China and let them joining again together. I don't know how they're gonna use it. Otherwise, Taiwan will be happening. It will be happen like Ukraine, only being used to be, to be at the hotspot in this region. So by then, we have every right as well in this region to ask AUKUS, the Quad, and FPDA to be dismissed. Otherwise, we are in a very big danger. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 10 minutes, 11 minutes. Bravo. It's very good. Now, and we come back to Bandung, to non-aligned movement, to UN, etc., etc. Now, we will go to very small countries of Caribbean or South America, or here you are, Guyana. Now, Devon, are you ready?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, your turn. Yes, your turn.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I should start with a disclaimer. Whatever I say in this event does not represent any organization, but is simply an express view of a Guyanese citizen. I'll depart from the angle of the previous speakers because I believe they have well established the historical context of the war and such like. And I want to focus my talk exclusively from the perspective of a small South American country which is in large part a pawn in the global realpolitik. This is evidenced by the fact that oil exploration is being done in Guyana by an American company, ExxonMobil. And in the wake of the war in Ukraine, the US has already reached out to Venezuela with a bid to ease sanctions on Venezuelan oil to enter the market, which shows that our existence is tied to the interests of world powers. We live in a globalized world, and anything that happens far and wide will affect every citizen of the world, either directly or indirectly. Guyana certainly has not escaped. It is sometimes amusing to hear Guyanese who could hardly pronounce Ukraine correctly, nor are fully aware of where the country is located geographically, nevertheless make comments about the war. Perhaps the most direct effects of the war that is currently being felt by the small man in Guyana is through their pockets. The price of food commodities has increased, especially those made from wheat, and gas prices have raised. From a political strategic perspective, I must point out certain similarities between the Guyana realpolitik and the war in Ukraine. Firstly, Putin believes that he's correcting a historical wrong that Russia experienced through what he calls a military intervention. Now, why is this similar to Guyana? Guyana is the third smallest territory in South America, as you can see on the map there. It shares borders with Suriname, Brazil, and Venezuela, and it has among the smallest and least capable military on the continent, as opposed to Venezuela, on the other hand, and Brazil. In general, we have enjoyed a peaceful coexistence with our neighbors, but an ongoing border controversy with Venezuela exists. The 1899 Arbitral Award, which demarcated the boundaries between then British Guyana and Venezuela, was accepted and celebrated by Venezuela at that time, since the British had ceded territory to Venezuela. When Guyana became independent in 1966, Venezuela declared that they considered the arbitral award null and void. This is what I would call the perceived historical wrong that is similar to the thinking of Putin. An agreement was inked under the auspices of the United Nations to bring about a resolution to the controversy. The UN Secretary General in this agreement was tasked with finding the most suitable means to resolve the issue from a menu of options, which for the large part was the UN Good Officers process. After yielding no results after a few decades, the UN Secretary General chose the International Court of Justice as the means to bring about a final and legally binding settlement to the controversy. Venezuela is not participating in this legal process and does not recognize the ICJ's role in resolving the controversy, in spite of the court's ruling that it has jurisdiction to settle the matter. Guyana believes that the war in Ukraine could set a precedent for large and powerful countries to intervene militarily in smaller, weaker nations to have their way and to correct perceived historical wrongs. Apart from the fact that Venezuela, which has the largest military in South America in terms of personnel and the fourth ranking in military might, is one of the few friends Russia has at the moment, it has demonstrated its willingness to resort to violence many times in Guyana's post-colonial past. Perhaps the most egregious was the first manifestation of this, with the violent takeover of Guyana's portion of the Ankoko Island and the establishment of a military base on the island, a mere 5 months after Guyana obtained independence. Secondly, Putin claims that his military intervention is to protect Russians, be it Russian-speaking or ethnic Russians that live in Ukraine's territory. Again, why is this similar to Guyana? As you know, Venezuela has been undergoing an economic crisis under the regime of Nicolas Maduro, with high inflation and common citizens suffer from a lack of basic needs. This triggered massive migration in various parts of Latin America. Guyana has also welcomed Venezuelan refugees, though not in large numbers as our Spanish-speaking counterparts. There is a fear that this influx of Venezuelans that are living mainly in the territory of Essequibo, which is the territory claimed by Venezuela, could be used as a pretext to invade militarily to protect the interests of these Venezuelans, similar to what Putin has done. This is not a far-fetched idea at all, since we do have experience in what we call the Rupununi uprising. This was a secessionist insurrection in Guyana that began on the 2nd of January 1969, where Valerie Hart, an indigenous politician, sought to create a Rupununi state. She traveled to Venezuela to seek the government's help in the form of military support, but this was not granted by Venezuela. In her quest, she agreed that should they receive support for the insurrection, she would grant Venezuela control over Guyana's disputed Essequibo territory in exchange for this assistance. While this was rebuffed by Venezuela back then, we cannot be sure that such a request will be turned down in the future by Venezuelan migrants or their descendants, having been adopted into Guyanese society in Essequibo. Thirdly, this war in Ukraine is also about oil and gas. The dependence of Europe, especially Germany, on Russian gas shows the difficult position such countries have in dealing with Russia. The pipelines from Russia also run through Ukraine's territory, incurring millions of dollars in fees that need to be paid to Ukraine annually. Ukraine, for its part, has large fossil fuel reserves and is capable of replacing a sizable portion of the gas that is supplied by Russia to Europe. Similarly, Guyana is a new frontier on the oil and gas front, with continuous discoveries resulting in millions of barrels of production. This is also an envious situation for Venezuela, which has shown its interest in this regard by unilaterally making declarations by the president, Nicolas Maduro, claiming almost all of Guyana's exclusive economic zone. This is where its oil and gas exploration and its reserves are based. And this was done in a way in which it defies international law. Finally, similar as in the case of Ukraine, the political borders have separated ethnic families. We do have 9 indigenous nations which have been separated by the political border between Guyana, Brazil, and Venezuela. This is an aspect that was pointed out in the speech by the Kenyan ambassador, Martin Kimani, to the UN Security Council, where he warned about the dangers of imperial revanchism. And I quote his words, "Kenya and almost every other African country was birthed by the ending of empire. Our borders were not of our own drawing. They were drawn in the distant colonial metropoles of London, Paris, and Lisbon. We believe that all states formed from empires that have collapsed or retreated have many peoples in them yearning for integration with people in neighboring states. This is normal and understandable. However, Kenya rejects such a yearning from being pursued by force. We must complete our recovery from the embers of dead empires in a way that does not plunge us back to new forms of domination and oppression." End of quote. Having said that, it is clear that for Guyana, this war is not a comfortable aspect for us, and only a peaceful resolution will suffice. I close with the words of Guyana's ambassador to the UN, Caroline Rodriguez-Burkett, and I quote, "Guyana deplores the threat of use of force in the conduct of international relations and urges a peaceful resolution of the differences that currently exist in consonance with the rule of international law and the provisions of the United Nations Charter. The aggression against Ukraine is a threat to the region and countries everywhere. The government of Guyana therefore supports the efforts of the UN Secretary General to bring a speedy resolution to the situation in Ukraine and cease the threats to international peace and security." On that note, I end my talk. Thank you.
Thank you. 10 minutes, Devon. And it is very interesting that Guyana and Venezuela, both of them are member of NAM, of Non-Aligned Movement. So that's the conflicts inside the Non-Aligned Movement. Okay, now it is more than 2 hours already. 2 2 hours and 22 minutes. So if I may, as a coordinator and initiator, to continue with the question and answer, but I would like to propose a break of music, 2 minutes. Is it okay? Now we have heard, we have listened to the North Korean Army Choir. Now the North Korean Children Choir will sing the same song, okay? 2 minutes. So that's the music. Now come to the session of question and answer. Who is willing to speak first? I think, Elena from Russia. Okay, Elena.
If you don't mind, I will use 2 minutes and then my student will continue, okay?
Yeah, but not so long because other friends wish to also to speak, okay?
Okay.
Especially from Africa. I see here our colleague Nwankwo, who is already raising hand. Now, just quickly. Short, okay? Elena, yes, yes, please.
And then my student, okay? My student, yes. At first, I agree with Bruno that all problems, and not only Bruno, somebody else, now I don't remember, that problems began from 90s years, when we began our reforms to capitalism. So in Ukraine and Russia, two capitalistic countries. But what it is interesting that yes, 2014, when they overthrown real president, Ukrainian nationalists began to attack Russian people in Lugansk and Donbass, and nobody is speaking about this, but they killed a lot of people. And to this period, when Russia decided to attack, they were preparing to attack Donbass and Lugansk, and Russia could not be silent. It is the reason why Patriotic of Russia supported president. And we have now, I want to say only that we have now a very interesting situation, that patriotic support president and liberal economists are against president. But in economy, we continue our liberal economic order. So now patriotic forces have a very interesting situation when they began to press our president to change the economic model. What I want to say is that if Russia will change the economic model, it means we will introduce state planning on principles of cybernetics. Everything is going in this direction. And Russia will receive new economic mechanisms which will help us to go away from crisis and to be the first country which will go away from the crisis. So this struggle now is the most interesting. because everybody is looking after our government, and what we have done, it is my opinion, that now we are in global government of economy. How to go to our autonomous system to government by economy? Our Lavrov said about this, we must do it. And the transition should be without any revolution, of course, because if it will be revolution, we will be totally destroyed. So what such press we can see in our different structures to president and between different groups, patriotic and those who hope that we will come back to our model of liberal economy, is very strong now. And we have this very strong battles on intellectual level. And in all our TV programs, the same battle. So I hope that we will be winners. I feel this because we are in such situation, and change of economic model, we will give very useful our present to the new world order, economic order. Thank you very much. I want that my student could continue.
Thank you. Very short. Yes, very short. Okay.
Okay.
After that, Tony from Nigeria and at the same time Rwanda.
Okay, I can continue.
Yes, very short. Okay.
Okay. Good day or good evening, dear colleagues. In my view, the current model of global financial management only continue to reinforce the centralization of capital in the hands of global corporations that need to provoke comprehensive economic chaos on the global stage. Moreover, transnational corporations use the coronavirus pandemic to pursue their vested interests, as evidenced by the huge number of biological bases found on the territory of Ukraine. However, today the military conflict in Ukraine is becoming the primary means of destroying social production and exterminating humanity. The leader of global governance long ago realized that after the outbreak of hostilities in Eastern Europe, there would be certain prices which would bring them additional super profits at the cost of, unfortunately, thousands of human lives. That is why they have been diligently cultivating a puppet neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine for 8 years by feeding it financial and technological handouts. Thus, the global corporations decided to take advantage of the fracturing of the Ukrainian nation to prepare a new bridgehead to strike at Russia. I want to know that global governance doesn't wish to stop there and is trying its best to warm up other melting pot of geopolitical interests. For instance, transnational corporations try to involve Russia and Japan and the conflict field regarding the Kuril Islands. Besides, there are rumors of potential Chinese attack on Taiwan, which causes outflow of foreign capital from these countries. And additionally, the Arab World, of course, which recently struck a US base in Iraq, as you know, cannot be discounted. Now, should we forget Russia's rich resource potential? On the one hand, the sanction policy of the West deprive us of access to elite products and expensive brands that not everyone could afford. On the other hand, the Russian government continue to cut fuel supplies, which, according to preliminary estimates, will cause energy prices, which provide basic human needs for food and security, to rise 14-fold by the end of this year. In addition, there are large deposits of uranium in Russia, and the shortage of uranium on the world market is getting worse by the day, causing panic in the US government, of course. Of course, Russia is still the only country in the world that can use its scientific and technical potential preserved since the day of the Soviet Union to introduce a dynamic model of intersectoral balance into economic management. In this case, Russia won't only develop a socially oriented strategy, but also become a full-fledged leader in cybernetic economic development. No, to conclude my speech, I would like to quote Friedrich Engels, whose words most profoundly, in my view, help us to understand the collapse, modern collapse of American hegemony in the world that is happening before our eyes. No people who oppress other people can be free. The power it needs to oppress other people always ends up oppressing itself. So let us try not to wait for more victims of sanction policies by jointly identifying ways in which humanity can move onto the trajectory of social progress, firstly, and secondly, construct a new model of multipolar world of independent national economies that have implemented new model of economic management. This is all. Thank you for your attention, dear colleagues.
Thank you very much. Now, well, it is economic issue. It is very interesting. I mean, the perspective after the war, what will be done by Russia? That is the question. But now, let us listen to Nwankwo Nwaijagwai from Nigeria and Rwanda at the same time. And I have to say that we did not have speaker from Africa. It is not deliberate. It is because I did not find confirmation. I didn't receive confirmation from African speakers, African scholars until the last minute. So, Tony, now.
Thank you, Brother Dawes of our Bandung firm and all the people present here. Yeah, we can see that.
King.
Oh, Papa Manoranja Mahonti.
Yes.
Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, remember 2015 in Jakarta and Bandung.
Yes.
Oh, yes. And I'm seeing Eka Swandelsa here. Eka here.
Eka is saying hello to you.
Oh, thank you, Mama. Mama, I can see your hand, Mama. Thank you very much. Yeah. You see, as we can see, the euphoria of the United Nations National Assembly Jamboree has passed, and we've seen everybody condemning Russia, people abstaining, just as it has always done with the case of Israel and the Palestinians. United Nations General Assembly has become a jamboree where people just out of sentiment, without looking at the facts of the story, and just, my people say, it's a case of a sheep joining the goat in a battle of horns. So that's the position, but the realities are on the ground now. Let me start. In 2009, you see, the African nations, in spite of their deprivation, in spite of the catastrophic political situation, still understand who their friends are. In 2019, during the Russia-African summit, let me quote Vladimir Putin, what he said. He said, we are not going to participate in a new repartition of the continent's wealth. Rather, we are ready to engage in competition for cooperation with Africa. That was the Russian situation. And you can see in Africa today, we have different tentacles of neocolonialism, the traditional Western neocolonialism trying to sustain their age-long historical hold on Africa. You have China coming from the East with their massive economic weaponry. And then you also have Russia gradually creeping in. Underlying this is also the innate competition between Israel and the Arab wars to take hold of Africa. That's the situation in Africa. And coming to Russia, you find that Russia's interest in Africa has been political, trying to give Africa an alternative political vision. Like in during the Cold War, Russia's presence in Africa helped a lot to expedite or to quicken African liberation, African independence. And that idea, that contribution, most Africans have not forgotten. up to this moment. And so after the initial United Nations voting pattern, United Nations General Assembly voting pattern, most African nations have now come back to realize, to look at the realities of the situation outside the Western propaganda machine. As the first speaker stated, this is a question of Anglo-Saxon pride against Russia. If you look at it from the period historically, you ask, let us even look at the Crimean War of 1853. What caused it that made Britain and other people to join against Russia in support of Turkey, a Muslim nation, just over an issue of the key in Israel? And if you have taken time to listen to Vladimir Putin, because most of us will just conclude, oh, invasion, but the same act of invasion have been committed in Vietnam, it has been committed in Libya, even in Cote d'Ivoire. Sarkozy had to use his plane to destroy the might of Gbagbo in order to put Alassane Ouattara there. Nobody questioned. Nobody talked about Libya. The Hutus, there are still crises in Yemen. Nobody's talking about that. It is only about just about blue eyes situation because it is happening. Yeah, blue eyes. And the Africans have also come to realize that even the Ukrainians themselves also resist, given the experience of African refugees, the refusal of their police to allow them to escape confidently with others in the train, the refusal of Poland to even accept them into their side. They are all reminiscent of the same racist impunity we are campaigning against. So Africans are beginning to realize it. And even coming to us, it's not a Putin war. It is a war, it is a Joe Biden's war. It is a war in which Biden, suffering from unpopularity in America, domestic unpopularity, is now using the Ukrainian situation to show off his popularity internationally. That is one. Secondly, it is also a war where Britain, I'm not trying to show you, let us even look at, I'm trying to take it from the dimension of those European nations that are on the forefront of this battle. Look at Britain. Why did Britain leave European Union? Simply because Britain, with her pride, will not see a situation where Germany will now act as the biggest economy in Europe. That's just the reason. And then they're also seeing the case of Russia now as a situation where Britain can now showcase her imperial, her dwindling imperial dignity. I want us to look at it from that way. You see the irony. How can you explain a situation where Ukraine and Russia are sitting down to settle their case, and US and Britain are supplying them arms to fight the same war? If there's peace today, where will we place the source of the peace? Is it on the basis of the mutual decision between Russia and Ukraine to maintain peace, or based on the weakness, the already orchestrated weakness of Russia, their inability to take over Ukraine, in a blow? These are the issues we have to look at. And thirdly, we have failed to look at the moral basis of Putin's situation. Let me bring you to Africa. We have refused to look at the policies, internal policies of Ukraine in terms of non-ethnic Ukrainian, especially the language policy. I tried to go through the 2019 language law that tried to impose Ukrainian language on people whose native languages are Russian, whose native language are Tatar, whose native language are even other Polish and Germans, which we in Africa cannot. If you do it in Nigeria, trying to impose another language on others, we will fight it. We will not accept it. And that is what is happening internally in Ukraine. The new revolutionaries trying to diminish the language, the native language of others. For example, Ukraine is not all Ukraine speakers. You have Russia, Ukrainians are just about 67%, Russians are about 30%. And you think your policy can now make this move to become in a modern country, the so-called European country, where countries like Switzerland have, 4 languages or 3 languages as the official languages, where even Britain, they have all the dialects, Welsh, Irish, Scottish are their own native language. And then the Europeans are not looking at this. They're only looking at the imperial, the fake imperial impetus of Russia. By the way, why did NATO come in? NATO came into being because of their need to confront the spread of communism. Oh, Russia, that was what we were talking. We are talking in our university during our days. Oh, to counter communism. That was the basis of NATO. Warsaw Pact. Warsaw Pact has disintegrated. Soviet Union has disintegrated. Communism as an economic and political ideology has also disintegrated. So why is the reason for the existence of NATO today if the same Russia has become capitalist? These are the fundamental questions we have not asked. Secondly, why should they not listen to Putin? Putin has even said, I'm not trying to be a Russian apologetic, apologetic about Russia, but I'm speaking as a historian. Putin has even said, look, we have told you people, we agreed that you people should not expand after the Berlin Wall, but you continue expanding one after the other. We have even tried to bring you into the secrecy of our nuclear programs, CIA and others, if you listen to him, and to show you that we have that confidence in living together. But still, as he said, that in 2017, a British parliamentarian talked about Russia being partitioned into 5 nations. That the idea is about turning Russia, turning Russia into petty states. So that is the issue. For us, in Africa, the First World War and the Second World War, they use Africans as guinea pigs. This time, Africans have realized that even the same people that are fighting do not regard them as one people. From the experiences of the African, refugees presently, running away from Ukraine. So Africans have decided to stay quiet, and any African man that tries to join any sanction, we do that on her peril, because sanctions, whether by Europe, whether by Arab nations, have always reverberated against Africa, because as import and export nations, unproductive, non-industrial nations, they're always at the receiving end. And we are glad that with BRICS, all this nonsense about Europe having the dominance of world economy will be put down. Again, finally, let us even look at it. We are seeing this at the end of the day, because this is an eye-opener. If a country like Switzerland, that is neutral, can now decide to go against Russia, it means that we are not free in this world. US can decide tomorrow to tell a country fighting against another United Nations meeting in New York. So I believe that it's not a new world order, but it is a conflict that will reorder the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. It's the voice of Africa, very relevant and interesting. And the last point, you said that the UN should not be based in New York because it is a US territory. And Sukarno already said in the 1960s that UN has to move, not from New York, has to move to neutral country. That's the word of Sukarno in 1960. Now, I see Desmond from Indonesia. You want to say something, Desmond?
I also raised my hand.
Oh yeah, also Beatrice. You want? Yeah. Who is the first, Beatrice or Desmond?
Beatrice, sir. Beatrice.
Beatrice. Okay. Yes, Beatrice first.
Thank
Desmond, you speak later. Okay.
I'll try to be brief.
Okay, sir.
Yes,
in
Beatrice, yes.
in a complex problem. Well, I agree that our Bandung spirit let us always be in favor of diplomatic solutions and peace as our fundamental basis to analyze everything. But we have to be realistic in a way that our world is far away from what we are dreaming with the world we are dreaming. And I would like to remind you some documents from the United States that I have been studying these last days for an article I wrote. And all the documents I have read, from the rent comparison, for instance, one which it was launched in 2016, Thinking the Unthinkable, the war with China. And in this period, all of the documents from the White House, from the Department of Defense, and the last one, which was released on March 1st, that means 2 weeks ago, by the Congressional Research Service, which is online, partially at least. This service is the one who prepares documents for the congressional to be aware of the problems they are expecting to be pronounced to. In this case, the budget, the military budget that Biden has sent to the Congress, And I was astonished, really, honestly. I will read, if you allow me, three sentences of this document. 2 weeks ago, the goal of preventing the emergence of regional hegemons in Russia is a major reason why the US military is structured with force elements that enable it to deploy from the United States cross broad expanses of ocean and airspace, and then conduct sustained large-scale military operations upon an arrival in Eurasia. And why is the aim of the US to prevent the regional hegemons in Eurasia? They say this way: the US goal of preventing the emergence of regional hegemons in Eurasia. I may also share the screen. Perhaps it's better than to read the document if you prefer, or just to continue. Well, the main reasons for the US to have the goal of preventing the emergence of regional hegemons in Eurasia. First, that given the amount of people, resources, and economic activity in Eurasia, a regional hegemon would represent a concentration of power large enough to be able to threaten vital US interests. Second, that Eurasia is not dependably self-regulating in terms of preventing the emergence of regional hegemons, meaning that the countries of Eurasia cannot be counted on to be able to prevent, through their actions, the emergence of regional hegemons. So all the documents I have been reading are clearly focusing on a solution which is based on war. There is no document from the White House, from the Department of Defense, from the congressional researchers that pointed any possibility of accepting, the US accepting the multipolarity. So with this background, I try to understand how can we with the Bandung spirit manage in a moment in which we have all conceded the United Nations has no power, has collapsed as a possible structure for assuring global stability, global security. So I know that we are facing huge challenges because all the tools we had that were conceived with the mentality post World War II are not enough, are not at this moment the tools that could put the way for a peaceful coexistence. I have read a lot about a very key concept that was conceived by the European Commission for Security. The name is not exactly like that. That is the indivisibility of security. It is not possible to divide the concept of security. That meant that if one country considers itself unsecure, all the peace is unstable. And so that was really one of the concepts that Putin has put on the table many times. And he was not the one who created this concept, because it was a concept that was elaborated in the Cold War and was repeatedly reaffirmed in all European documents that appeared from the 70s till now, even reaffirmed last year. So documents are pointing key questions, but documents are papers, and the reality is of guns, unfortunately. I really feel that we have to insist on the Bandung spirit, but how can we manage without a public opinion on the streets? Because this means of communication with this cognitive war, this fake news, this everything which is trying to affect the capacity of people to understand the problems, to be independent, we would like to be. How can we manage with the 2 years of COVID pandemic? The streets are no more the place to put our demands. People are not anymore on the streets, with some exceptions. We have here in Latin America the very extraordinary experience of the Chilean, who in the streets have conquered the possibility of having a new government and a new constitutional assembly. But it's not, for instance, in Europe and in the States. I remember the pictures of the war in Vietnam with huge demonstrations against the war and trying to put the government into the commitment to look for peace and to negotiate. No more. We haven't this. So I think we have lost, at least by the moment, the battle of the minds of people and the minds and their decision to really fight for their ideas, and particularly the idea of peace, of diplomatic solutions. I'm really optimistic in general, but in this moment, I'm very afraid that in the short time, it will be very difficult to implement our Bandung Spirit platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Now we go back to Desmond from Indonesia.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Darwis. I'm Desmond from Indonesia, from Museum of the
Yes,
Asia.
from Bandung, yes.
Yeah, yeah. How are you, sir?
Now go
It
to
has
Indonesia.
long
Yes,
been
please.
each other. Yeah, the point is about the architecture of world security from what is the peaceful coexistence now in the Ukraine and Russia. Number one, there are two origins of peaceful coexistence principle in the Dasar Sela Bandung, as we know before. The first is from the 5 principles coexistence, and the second part is from the 7 pillars of peaceful coexistence. And this is the issue now we are facing. Number 2, the peaceful coexistence was designed during the international system of bipolar war, but now it is now multipolar system. But the peaceful coexistence is still quite relevant. It means that the peaceful coexistence has been examined by 2 international systems. Number 3, as we know that it was declared by President Sukarno in the opening session of the Bandung Conference 67 years ago, that the solution that can be taken by the people in Asia and Africa who believes in the peaceful coexistence is by using the force of moral violence. And number 4, we have to acknowledge that the dilemma security is still real, and the choice of security treaty and collective defense are still the option than the security community and defense community. And the last one, in this new multipolar system international, the security treaty and collective defense should live side by side in harmony with the security community and defense community. Thank you, Mr. Darwis, for the opportunity.
Thank you, thank you. Now, is there anybody? Now it's already 3 hours. Our conversation has taken 3 hours.
Anna Maria
Marcia, yes, still Marcia.
Yes. Okay, just
okay, Marcia.
Just very, very briefly.
Yeah, okay, yes. Anyway, we will come back to another round, round, because it is very complex.
I would like. I'm very happy that Beatrice mentioned the RAND corporation, because that's a very important and very sensitive point. The RAND Corporation published a document that I think Beatrice read some parts of it. And the title is Overextending and Unbalancing Russia. Published by the RAND Corporation in 2019. So there was already in 2019 a plan to unbalance Russia and to strengthen Ukraine in order to unbalance Russia and in order to, reaffirm the American hegemony in Eastern Europe, letting apart the NATO bases spread along the former Soviet republics and along the borders with Russia. So let's forget it for the time being. But we have to put, we shouldn't forget that this plan of reaffirming the American hegemony worldwide is not, it doesn't, focus only on Eastern Europe or in Latin America, but it's coherent with the similar projects that the United States carried out in the Middle East since the mid-1990s. I'm talking about, for instance, the documents that have been published in the United States by the neocon, people and representatives or circles. I'm talking about the so-called Project for a New American Century. That's its so-called think tank that planned, the breakout of the Middle East. A very famous document written by Richard Perle, and its title is A New Break, that it's planning the breakout, the fragmentation, and the cancellation of Libya, of Syria, of Iraq. And they decided that they should start with Iraq, because Iraq was one of the main, the most powerful countries in the Middle East, and all of them are enemies of Israel. I also agree with I don't know how to pronounce your name, Nwankwo.
Nwankwo, yes.
Nwankwo. So I agree also with him that in a certain way, all these issues are related, if not exactly on Israel-Palestine relations, but at least on Middle East and Arab countries and Israel relations too. And I think that all this picture affects, obviously, also Africa, because when Egypt falls into the American sphere, no, with the Al-Sisi government, then this project involves also Africa, because after all, Egypt, even if we think that it's a Middle Eastern country, and it's a Middle Eastern country, but it's one of the most important African countries. So we have to keep that in mind. And I share also Beatrice's pessimism, because it's true, and I'm not thinking this, I don't have this thought from now. I've always been very skeptical about, I appreciate the Bandung spirit, because otherwise I wouldn't be here. But at the same time, I'm very skeptical, because I think that our instruments, our tools are too weak in front of the massive power of what is going on now. And I remember that at the end of the conference, our conference in February, we spoke a lot about multipolarism. And Beatrice mentioned a scholar who was talking about unipolarism. Well, these are ideals. This is an utopian world. I concluded my own remarks at that conference saying about, because I was talking about a totally different subject, but anyway, I remember what I said, and I said, I don't see any multipolarism in this world. I see just still a bipolar world. So if we don't realize that bipolarism is still there, I don't think that will be very effective in our actions. And one more very short remarks. Thi Wang speaks about a Western dominant view, and that we Westerners, we are supposed to have accepted the present situation as an unavoidable situation. So I'm also very critical about this view, because in the West, we were biased in a way regarding the so-called Orient. So we promoted the Orientalist view of Asia. But if you still think about the West as a very uniform body, as a monolithic entity, you do the same mistake that we have done as a colonial, I don't want to use the term civilization, but as a colonial system, Western colonial system. So we looked at the East as an Orient, and we thought for centuries that Orient was Orient. So it was, a uniform cultural or geographic entity, while it's not. So I don't want to speak about Western, because otherwise you have the Westernalism bias. So we should, at least in our circles, try to overcome, these barriers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
One finished. If we can talk more about these American projects to impose the American hegemony at the international level, because we can't talk about the solutions if we don't know exactly the projects of our enemy. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Now, Thi Guang, I see that you want to speak. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, I mean, as a response to the previous comments, I think I strongly agree with you that we shouldn't view West as a homogenic entity, and I particularly anxious about using the West and versus the Orient in that term, in that sense. So therefore, I think it is important for us to talk about liberal imperialism rather than a geographic division between the West and the East. And one thing, however, I would suggest to look into is that the Western-centric terminology is still functionable. Because essentially, as we can see today, the way that we view the world is essentially based on a sequence of terminologies and historical experiences that derives from the Western experience or the European experiences. One of them being our understanding of nationalism. I strongly agree with Nwanko's comments that the way that we use nationalism or understanding nationalism to decode the world's problem is problematic, because as we can see, the way that the society organizes itself outside Europe is not essentially focusing around the issue of one language, one ethnic group, one country, whereas instead the interaction and cooperation among different group of people is crucial. So therefore, as an analytical category, I would say that we should take a step back and review the Eurocentric ontology in the way of using those terminologies. One of them being hegemonic stability. And I want to argue that hegemonic stability argument or worldview is essentially imperialist, because think about that. In the past, in the past decades, right, we've been brought up, infused with the rhetorics that what the rise of one nation states will inevitably lead to the decline of another. And that's one. Another foundation in that hegemonic stability theory is fundamentally the rise of a nation will lead to an expansionist regional power. So therefore, all the rhetoric that the American strategic policy was focusing on suppressing the rise of certain regional powers, henceforth in order to enhance its own stability, right? But that kind of a combative narrative is not necessarily the case, because there is no hard evidence to prove that the rise of one will inevitably lead to the decline of the other. The rise of one leading towards the decline of another is only accurate in the case of European capitalist history. Looking at historical experiences that we've seen, today's issue the Americans was trying to resolve was very similar to the issue that Britain was facing in the late 19th century when talking about the rise of the decline of the decline of British Empire and the rise in the sense of rise of Germany as a competitor. So therefore, we can see that in the late 19th and early 20th century, a rhetoric of, for example, Anglo-Americanism, arguing that the unification of of Britain and America along the color line, that the white man's country would bring prosperity to the rest of the world. We can also see that some of the British imperialists argue that the Imperial Federation is the promise for the future. And that Imperial Federation is solely focusing on the rising of, on maintaining the status quo that the British Empire enjoyed for the past century. So therefore, and then as a counter argument, the German theorists start to argue that we need breathing space, the grand space, the space that Carl Schmitt would argue that it is important for the Germans to breathe, but not within the area of German territory, but also with the neutral space alongside Germany so that it has the place to maneuver and survive. And those arguments would only be true if we consider that this is not a universal experience, but precisely a European experience. And without acknowledging the singular or the uniqueness of this kind of a terminology and experience, we'll never be able to imagine a better world order, a world order that does not necessarily rely on the rhetoric of hegemonic stability. And so moving beyond that, I do have, although I'm concerning about the current situation, but I'm optimistic in general. The optimistic in a sense that I do see that there is a strong tendency and political momentum in the non-alliance movement. Non-alliance, not necessarily in the sense that it's a stable international institution, but non-alliance as a spirit of the non-European / modern European capitalist world order could be possible through reviving and reinvestigating the resources within the broader Afro-Asian and Latin American world. And I think I propose that as an ontological issue rather than an institutional terminology. Finally, on the institutional level, I think there is hope because at the moment we do see the rise of the of non-European and or non-conventional sort of capitalist states. Sort of the states on one hand, the states like China, states in the growing power like India, and even nowadays sort of across the Eurasia continent, small but fervently believing in solidarity and independent states across the Eurasian continent. And nowadays within Europe, sort of party movements and social movements calling for a non-interventionist perspective of geopolitics and foreign policy, and sort of arguing against NATO / European Union as a sort of imperialist power. All those elements are rising. And I think with the rising elements across the Eurasia continent, and with a bit of sort of push coming from intellectuals like all of you, we would be able to see a lot of alternative world order. Fundamentally, to conclude, and I think we shouldn't see an empire, particularly modern empire, as a solid entity. Modern empire, starting from Dutch to British and then American empires, are empires of networks. They're not necessarily, surely these empires has been living upon a strong states that provides them with military forces and powers and nuclear weapons. However, it's not all. As we can see today, America was so reluctant to send troops, to send boots on the ground, and very strongly pro sort of destabilizing the regional stability by provoking an information war, leaking out all those information about sort of the Russian threat and about the Chinese threat and the potential China and the Russia alliance forming some sort of an evil axle that will fight against the entire world. All those issues, they are just talking. So far, we haven't seen, apart from selling weapons to the conflict zones, US has done nothing. So therefore, I think there is a glimpse of hope of destabilizing that network, that vast imperialist network, piece by piece, identifying where does the imperialist hegemonic power lays, identify the strategic skills that the big gigantic imperialist network is utilizing. For example, media outlets, English-dominated media outlets, for example, financial instruments such as SWIFT, such as WTO, and World Bank, all those things that we intellectuals have been talking about for a long, long time. So I do see there is hope. And of course, if there is war breaking out finally, I don't think the Americans will win that war. There is no way an empire would fight, an empire of minority would win a war against the majority.
Okay, that's all, Chiguang, okay? Okay, thank you. I have 3 points, very quick, because Manoranjan want to speak, but he disappeared. Well, the first, you are touching what we organized since 2017, the conference series, The Rise of Asia. That's the first point. So I am happy to hear your remark. And the second, on non-alignment. When we organized 60 years of Bandung in Sorbonne with Samir Amin, we asked what is the relevant of non-alignment now, because there is no Cold War. The URSS already collapsed. But Samir Amin said the non-alignment essentially is non-alignment to imperialism and colonialism, not non-aligned to US or non-aligned to Soviet Union, but non-aligned to imperialism and colonialism. That's why non-alignment is still very relevant, as you said. And the third, your identification of the, for example, the weak point of this hegemony. Samir Amin already identified 5 tools of domination: science and technology, information, communication, media, financial architecture, mass destructive weapon, and control to access to natural resources. This is the West try to monopoly. This is the monopoly control over the 5 tools of domination. That's my comments. Now, Mano, you want to say something? Yes.
No, I thought we should be moving towards conclusion.
Yes.
And I think there are 2 points of consensus,
yes,
despite a variety of statements. One is the voices of Bandung and non-alignment and Global South are present all over the world. And voices of domination, hegemony are also present all over the world, even in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, not only in Europe and US. Therefore, they are not territorial, they are political economy phenomenon, namely, as Samir Amin said, imperialism and colonialism. They are not just a territorial state. Sometimes they are, but very often these voices, these forces, these political forces are all over the world. That's first point. And we are united to fight those tendencies within our own countries as well as globally. The point I want to make is 2 approaches to fighting imperialism and hegemony have emerged. One is we confront such a destructive strategy, long-term strategy and determination of US-led imperialism and hegemonic forces that we are pushed towards accepting strong powers using the new strength of China and Russia, or India, I think in not too distant future, or Indonesia also, and so on. That is one approach, because you need, as Beatrice put it, you have to be realistic. I think Marja also, several others have put it that way. But the other way is the new strength of these powers, emerging powers, have to be used for 21st century values, the anti-colonial dreams and visions. And therefore, the world forces have to unite to push these powers, and allies all over the world, including in the Western countries, to strive for example, right now, neutrality, substantive neutrality and multi-ethnic status of Ukraine, and similar things to contain NATO expansion, serious security guarantees so that Russia feels guaranteed about its security. And American, US-led NATO expansion strategies are contained. The point is, if we have the same framework that guides Land Corporation's advisory, also for China and Russia, or India and Indonesia, Brazil, and so on, then we are in that game of terror and war and destruction. I think that paradigm, I think that was the challenge of the Bandung forces and non-alignment movement. I would say Bandung-Belgrade-Havana spirit leads us for the alternative paradigm. I think, but we have to discuss and continue this dialogue.
Yes, thank you very much, Mano. So you are promoting our upcoming conference in Indonesia in conjunction with the G20 summit on Bandung-Belgrade-Havana conference. Besides G20, in the same space, in the proximity of space and time in Bali. So this will be October this year. So please take note. With this, I will not conclude, but what I suggest, and I think Mano also suggesting, Beatrice also, and Dimitris also, Hans Köchler also, that we should form a kind of small working group to draft a kind of statement or a declaration, and also in the perspective of our upcoming conference. But I saw here Gracjan wants to say something. Gracjan, still want to say something?
Yes.
Okay.
As a conclusion, because we must back to the core issue, empirical facts that we observe now in Ukrainian crisis and Ukrainian Russian war. We must look carefully what is happening, because minute by minute, because we could be in situation of Third World War, when the NATO want to push their force into Ukraine and help to Ukrainian government to struggle with Russia. We observe the old Anglo-Saxon strategy, divide et impera, because when we looked at Central and Eastern Europe, we observe that it is very good for defending Anglo-Saxon hegemony when Slavic nations are at the war with themselves. From the one side, Russia and Belarus, and from the other, Ukraine and Poland. So it is, I think, very, very, very extreme situation now, and we should, I think we should support every proposition of mediation between Russia and Ukraine, especially by China, and activists also Turkey now.
Okay, that is, you answer the question, who will take back Ukraine? It is Russia, Ukraine, but maybe world community, not only Russia, and because it is world affairs. So it must be the affairs of UN, of all over the world. So that's the question of the Bandung song. Let's take it back.
The people of Ukraine should take back Ukraine.
Yes. Now with that, I will present the last concert. 2 minutes also, the same song, Halo Bandung, but played by Symphony Orchestra of Indonesia.
Dear Darvish, before the symphonic, symphonic orchestra, can I say one word?
Oh, yes.
I agree very much with Gracjan, and I said that we are in the introduction to the Third World War in a way or another.
Yeah.
So the question of timing is important. We have at least an appeal not to go there, not to go to a third world war, to be drafted very quickly, because events are unfolding and we don't know when what will happen.
Okay, thank you. So we will listen to the music, and at the same time you can disconnect if you wish. So this is to end our meeting today, but we will meet next time. Okay. Wait. So we end our meeting. There are still 22 people. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presence and your participation, active participation or passive participation. Now I will stop the recording. Okay.
Bye-bye.